Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 161 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where today the grief is still too near for us to go on with the story after what happened 2 weeks ago.
It's a matter for tears, and not yet for podcasting. So we're continuing our break tonight, folks, and we'll step into the common room here in just a moment. But first, I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the Man of the West, who's hopefully not going to stagger and fall before sliding into the abyss, Alan Sisto.
Fly, you fools! Especially you, Pippin! Before we stumble over our answers once again, I guess.
Yeah, fly before that, exactly.
Definitely. Now, that means that tonight we are having our 10th Questions After Nightfall episode, which is stunning, in which a few of our patrons online with us here in the common room tonight have come prepared with some of their very best questions to ask us. Now, we have advised them, however, that any question having to do with Balrog wings is off the table. We are done with that.
We are so done with that question.
So done. Half-hour sidebar will do that to you.
Yeah. Now, folks, as always, we have no idea what our guests are going to ask us, so Alan and I are going to be answering questions on the fly. And after saying questions on the fly so many times, I've been told by listeners that we need to start clarifying whether we're actually going to be answering questions on the classic horror film The Fly with Jeff Goldblum. And I think you know the answer to that, folks. Yes, of course we are.
Well, you're going to be on your own for that one, Sean.
Not, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of
totally not. It might be fun for, a special occasion sometime. Maybe we'll do a... No, we won't. I don't know what I'm saying.
No.
Just don't let me talk anymore.
I won't. As with previous Questions After Nightfall episodes, aside from any possible edits for nervous coughs from our listeners and time spent flipping through pages from us as we look for an answer, we will be presenting this as it was recorded live. Everything you hear in this show will have been recorded during this session.
Everything you see now is happening now.
That's right.
And if you'd like to get in on the next one, go check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/prancingponypod. We'll be doing Questions After Nightfall episodes every quarter, and we'll be inviting patrons at the Elrond's honorarium tier and higher to join us.
That's right. It's just one of the many ways we're saying thank you to our patrons, giving them the opportunity to get to know us a little better, make us laugh, stump us, and occasionally or frequently or almost all the time embarrass us in the best possible way. Now, along the way, we'll be referencing as many books as we can to back up our answers. We've each got a few ebooks on our computers here with us.
Yeah, and I usually have a few physical books in the booth here with me, so I don't get caught off guard, but I forgot to do that tonight. So, folks, I am at your mercy.
Oh, my.
Yeah, I know. But I've got some ebooks, so I think I'll be covered there. But anyway, since we get lots of questions from listeners about our sources, we want you all to remember that all the books that we've mentioned on the show are linked in our show notes to each episode and on the official library page of our website, theprancingponypodcast.com.
And there's a lot of other stuff on our website, too. Show notes and book links specific to each episode, outtakes, Prancing Pony Ponderings, and a few other little extras.
You'll also find a link to our online storefront at teespring.com/stores/PPP, where you can find shirts, mugs, stickers, and other great Prancing Pony Podcast gear.
Absolutely. But now, why don't we go ahead and get started with the questions? Sean, who has the first one tonight?
Okay, well, first up tonight, we have Jim.
All right, Jim, welcome.
Hey, how are you doing? This is Jim from Maryland, just north of Annapolis, and I'm the proud new owner of an Etched Prancing Pony Podcast beer mug.
Ooh, nice.
Excellent.
Nice.
Many thanks for that. And last time I was on this program, I let you know that I knew Linda Lay back when she was Linda Johnson.
That's right.
Yeah.
That was brilliant.
I've been laughing about that ever since. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to let you know I've kept in touch with her sister, Elizabeth Johnson, as well. She had some real estate in Numenor just before the price of land plunged there a while ago. And a lot of her friends call her Liz and Lizzie. I think that's kind of disrespectful, so I'll call her Beth.
Oh man.
Wow.
I don't even know what to say, Jim. My hat is off to you.
I call it Beth. Wow.
And I was prepared to jump in with something about, they really took a dive.
That was a classic pun that is going to definitely take its place in the Hall of Fame here on the Prancing Pony Podcast.
We need to have a Hall of Fame on the website someday. I'll put that on the list for things to do someday.
I think we do.
Epic puns.
All right, Jim, let's go ahead and get to your question. What do you have for us tonight?
I have so many questions. What the heck are we going to do about the Watcher in the water out front of the broken doors of Moria? Who was the first dwarf to break in on the Balrog that was buried deep, and what did he react to? But a little more serious note, all of the trek through Moria and even before in Holland, where the company was going past the ruins of civilizations being and gone, it struck a very Anglo-Saxon kind of chord in me, where you had these near savages who were wandering in lands and they were seeing great works that, say, the Romans and other civilizations, but especially the Romans, they built before them,
Right.
and that led very much to a theme that goes throughout all of Tolkien's works of the glory that was the
Right.
ones who came before us, our fathers who made blade and armor that we cannot match because their secrets are lost, and
Right.
that struck me as particularly true to the Germanic themes of some of the Germanic mythology and such like. It reflects back on that. Some people thought these works were the works of gods, but some realized that they were just their ancestors who had access to craft they didn't have anymore. I was wondering, do you notice these same sorts of parallels? And is this as an Anglo-Saxon sort of thing, or is this more generally a European kind of route that Tolkien was tapping into?
That's an interesting question.
That is a good question. Speaking as an American, it's easy to forget that in Europe, people are surrounded by ancient things all the time.
Ancient history, yeah.
That's
true.
One friend of mine who listens to the podcast once said something to the effect of, a European is somebody who thinks that 200 miles is a long way. An American is somebody who thinks that 200 years is a long time.
That's a great way to put it.
I think, and I wish I could remember who said that, because I would like to give credit to them for it. But if you hear me say that and it was you who told me that, please raise your hand and let me know so that I can give you credit on a future episode. But that's one of the most profound and hilarious things I've ever heard.
Yeah, and it's true. We don't have that sort of scope, do we? Especially, I mean, maybe on the East Coast it's different, but for me, especially in California, the oldest buildings in my town are like 50 years old. I mean, I scratched that. There is one barn that I think belonged to the land when it was orange groves. It might be 100 years old.
Yeah,
that's it.
The oldest
that's
building,
like yesterday in Europe.
The oldest building in Austin is probably, well, it might, no, I don't even think it's the Capitol. I think there's an old post office that's sort of right on the edge of town that's like maybe 150 years old,
Yep.
But yeah, I do think that there is some truth to the idea that this is just a European thing. Europeans are frequently surrounded by ancient things. But something specific that you said there, Jim, which is this idea that these ancient things that we're surrounded by were created by people who possessed a craft that we don't possess. These are things that we can't do now. That I don't know that is a modern European thing. I think, obviously we live in a time that's more technologically advanced than a few hundred years ago. But it is a very Anglo-Saxon thing because, as you said, the Anglo-Saxons were living in a time after the fall of the Roman Empire, and they were surrounded by this, one of my favorite phrases in Old English, say it with me, Eald enta Eowyrk.
Eald enta Eowyrk. Yeah, absolutely.
The old work of giants. And that was their explanation. They thought, like you said, Jim, they thought it was gods who built these things. They thought it was giants. And so they're constantly surrounded by this stuff. And that is a very present theme in Tolkien's work. Yeah. It's a very Germanic thing. It's very Anglo-Saxon specifically, especially when you look at, Anglo-Saxon poems like The Wanderer. And I think you really do see a lot of it in book 2, don't you? Because you see the fellowship. I think you see a lot of it in book 1 too. When you see Aragorn and the hobbits going past Weathertop and things like that.
Right. The ruins.
But you really do see so much of it in book 2, specifically with Holland and with Moria. I'm thinking, Alan, we recently recorded the episode that has Gimli singing his song about Durin.
Yes.
That song is all about Eald enta Eowyrk, isn't it?
It is. It really is. It's
all about how Moria was this place of beauty and light, and they were working mithril, and they were doing all kinds of great things there, and they can't do that anymore. The dwarves are a civilization in decline to a certain degree. And I think
Yeah.
most of Middle Earth is a civilization in decline in Tolkien's
Absolutely.
work, at least at the point
Even
of
the
Lord of
men.
Rings. Mm-hmm.
I know that the
Yeah.
men are on the rise, so to speak. Certainly they're going to be the ones taking over. But I can't help but think of Gimli and Legolas when they get to Minas Tirith, and
Mhm.
Gimli observing that there's great stonework here, but that the best stonework is the oldest,
Yeah.
and that the new stuff
Yes.
isn't as good.
Yeah.
And that is another example of ale into work,
Absolutely.
and how, only that ancient stuff demonstrates the level of craftsmanship, of expertise, of knowledge, and we're in a fading time. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. And there's hints of that throughout the Legendarium, and you get some of it in The Hobbit when Thorin is remembering the good old days. There's an element of that.
I think even when they get to Erebor and they make some observations about what they were capable of versus what they are capable of.
Like the big liquid gold dwarf that they had there in the book.
No, the liquid gold dwarf. Gosh.
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
What am I going to do with you, Sean? That was terrible. I had finally forgotten about that absolute abomination of a film.
That's why I'm here, man, is just to remind you of that scene specifically every chance I get.
That scene in particular, the whole idea that you're going to drown a dragon in liquid gold. Man.
Yeah. No, but I'm sorry that I derailed
you.
You're absolutely right, though, because that is very much what they see around them in Erebor.
Yeah.
And I think
signs of what they could have done.
And I think Holland too. And what I really like about the passage through Holland is you get a particularly elvish spin on this, because they talk about how the land is still wholesome, or parts of the land are still wholesome. There's a line
once
in
the
there,
elves have lived there, it never wholly
takes
forgets
a long
them,
time for their influence to. I can't remember exactly how it's worded in the book. You'll have to find it for me.
I think I may have just done that it never wholly forgets them or something like that, or it takes a long time for them to wholly forget it.
Yeah. So you get a real elvish spin on that. And then, you see things like the holly trees that are still there, and there is that reminder of a greater time. So I really particularly like that one. But it's definitely a common theme in Tolkien, and it's definitely a very Anglo-Saxon thing, Jim.
Yeah, I agree. And the line you're looking for, Sean, is much evil must befall a country before it wholly forgets the elves, if once they dwelt there.
There you go. Thank you, man.
So I did kind of get the line, the wholly forgets, but I didn't quite get it right.
Well, the wholly forgets part is kind of the best part, because that's the part
isn't it?
Personifies the land itself. Yeah,
it really does. By the way, I should give a hat tip to listener Phil, who is in the common room tonight, ready to ask a question here for Questions After Nightfall, with a great line. The liquid dwarf was really bad, but not Alfred bad. And I have to agree.
I co-sign that, yes.
Absolutely. All right, Jim, thank you for a great question. Sean, who do we have up next?
Next up is going to be DeMay.
DeMay. All right. Well, DeMay, welcome back. You're probably our most long-lived veteran here at Questions After Nightfall. We're glad to have you again.
Not so long-lived, just old.
Well, meaning you've been with us the most often. Oh, poor choice of words on my part.
You're the veteran.
That's right.
That would be me, the
battle-weary veteran of the Prancing Pony Trenches.
That's right.
I may be a veteran, but I do know that I probably scared Sean and Douglas Anderson when I picked them up from the airport. I am from Alaska, and yes, we do drive oddly here, but that's because we have to avoid things like moose and large ice things lying in the middle of the road.
It's one of my fondest memories, DeMay, was riding in the car with you and Douglas Anderson on the way to
I wish I'd been there. I wish I'd done that. I don't know why I insisted on renting a vehicle. That was silly of me.
It was a fun time. Anyway, I'm DeMay from Alaska, where it is still exceedingly cold. If you listen to this in the future, it is the beginning of March here, and it's still well below 0 Fahrenheit.
Oh, my. The land has wholly forgotten warmth, I'm sure.
Yeah. And human decency. All right.
Now you're making me laugh. Okay. Well,
that's rather the point, isn't it?
I have a vocabulary question, and then based out of this vocabulary question comes a social mores question.
Oh my.
And it has to do with the word, I guess it's a prefix, dwemer, because it turns up all over the place. We've got dwemer crafty. We've got Dwemer in more places than one. The Dwemelberg, and of course, my favorite, the Dwemer Lake. Now, the one
Mm-hmm.
that I have the biggest question about is when Eomer meets Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli out on, the plains.
Mm-hmm.
He says to them, he is a wizard, both cunning and dwemer crafty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is
Yeah.
the social mores thing. Why would you talk to total strangers in this odd vocabulary? Doesn't he know better than to just be polite and say, he's not a very nice guy?
Well, that's an interesting question. I almost want to answer the second half of that first, but I don't think we can. I think we need to start with the understanding of what that means first, because in doing so, we'll get to, I think, why Eomer speaks that way. So dwemer is a Middle English variant of the Old English word dwimmer, D-W-I-M-O-R. And of course, because the Rohirrim are representative of Anglo-Saxon, it's not a surprise that he would use a word that has its roots in Old English. By the way, the word itself simply means illusion.
You're absolutely right about that, Alan. I've actually got, there's an entry on it in Ring of Words, which
excellent.
folks
I'm
know
glad
is
you have that handy.
one of my
Yeah.
favorite reference works on word nerdery. But yeah, they've got an entry on Dwemer-like. And they say basically what you just said. The word, the first part of that, the Dwemer, is an Old English stem found in they give the form Yedwimmer with a GE at the beginning of it. But yeah, just like you said, it means, I think you said it means phantom or illusion. They say it means apparition, phantom, delusion, delusive practice, or witchcraft. And I think that witchcraft is really a telling meaning of that word.
I think so too.
And they do say that in Middle English, the word it appears mainly abstract, but Tolkien has made it a concrete noun, presumably meaning sorcerer. They do say that Dwemer also appears in Dwemer-crafty, a derivative of Old English Dwemer-craft, which is used by Éomer to describe Saruman, as Demay said. And here's something very interesting. Getting to that question about the social mores, I do want to read directly from Ring of Words here, because they point out that the word actually has some positive connotations as well as negative ones in the book. The authors of Ring of Words say it also appears in two place names, Dwemerberg, the haunted mountain at the rear of Dunharrow and Rohan, and Dwemerdene, literally Veil of Illusion, the name used in Rohan for the elvish land of Lothlorien.
Right.
So there we've got, three very negative connotations of the Witch King and Saruman and the haunted mountain at Dunharrow. And then we've got this one very positive connotation for Lothlorien.
Except that for the Rohirrim, it's not necessarily positive.
From
their perspective, that's the thing. They see Lothlorien in the same way that they see Saruman.
That's absolutely right. And if I can go back to Ring of Words here, they do say, it may seem remarkable that the same word is used to refer both to evil magic and to the benign power of the elves. However, it is clear from the words of Wormtongue, skipping ahead a little bit, that in the minds of the Rohirrim there was little distinction. Both were extremely dangerous. The identification of the essentially good elves with the power of evil magic is one of Tolkien's themes. And I am remembering when we read last year, Tolkien Reading Day, we read the theme was Tolkien and the Mysterious. And
that's right.
One of the sets of passages that we read, I think that I read, was specifically in regards to the mystery of Lothlorien and the mystery of Galadriel, and the fact that a lot of men, particularly the Rohirrim, really did not understand that. They thought that was
fearful.
Evil. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I guess that's a slightly tangential question to Demay's question, which is why Éomer is being quite so blunt with Saruman. But I don't know. I think it still goes back to that essential fear of magic and that essential distrust of sorcery and any arcane arts that the Rohirrim
In fact, that is his way of saying he's a really bad guy.
Yeah, I think it is.
This is a red flag. He's a sorcerer. He's an illusionist.
That's just it. Yeah, and it's not that he's just an evil sorcerer. He's a sorcerer, and that in itself makes him untrustworthy.
Exactly. That makes him unreliable, somebody you shouldn't deal with, somebody who's dangerous. He would say the same thing about Galadriel.
Absolutely, he would.
It's the exact same thing from his perspective, from the perspective of the Rohirrim.
Right.
But the word choice itself for the Rohirrim is natural, given their representation is essentially Anglo-Saxons.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense that Tolkien was use a very archaic word here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like Dwemer is one of my absolute favorite words in the entire
Isn't it?
book.
I love that one.
I can't wait to get to that part.
No, that is
It'll be a
gonna
few
fun.
years, but
It will be. It will be a long time. Dwayne, that was a great question. Thank you for that one. Sean, who do we have up next?
all right. Next up, we've got Phil.
All right, Phil, welcome aboard. How are you tonight?
Very good. Hi, this is Phil from San Diego. I'm delighted to be here for my first time. My question is, I think, mostly conjecture,
Okay.
so no pressure on this one. But it's also a little nuanced, so bear with me.
Fair enough.
My question concerns the 9 and the 7 rings.
Okay.
And I understand why 7 rings for the dwarves because of the 7 fathers, elder fathers.
Right.
But 9 seems like a rather arbitrary number for men.
Yeah.
And also, why would the Gwaithie Myrdain, and excuse my pronunciation on some of these,
Okay.
want to make rings for men anyway? I mean, the Noldo weren't exactly kumbaya with the other free peoples a lot of the time. And
that's a very good point.
I understand that Celebrimbor had a very special relationship with Narvi and presumably Durin III. But wouldn't most, if not all, of the men that they respected have presumably sailed off the continent to Numenor? And I should add, I don't really know how much interaction the elves had with men in Holland anyway. So this kind of leads to another aspect of my question, which is, do you think the rings were designed for the 3 peoples from the start? Or was Sauron just trying to get the elven smiths to create as many rings of power with his malware in it as he could?
With his malware. I love that.
I like that.
Oh, thank you. At the time, everything went bad. I mean, and Sauron's true plan was revealed. Celebrimbor has a bunch of lesser essays of the craft beginner rings. He has 9 kind of, now we're getting somewhere, say, like B+ rings. We know from Unfinished Tales of the history of Galadriel and Celeborn that Celebrimbor valued the 7 over the 9, which he was willing to cough up immediately. The 7 had to be tortured out of him. So maybe the 7 are like A- rings. And then maybe after those, Celebrimbor felt he had the skill set and went off to make the 3 in private. So I guess the ultimate question is, do you think Sauron captured 16 rings plus the other rings and thought, well, these 7 can go to ensnare the dwarves, and these leftover 9 I can give to my best 9 kings and chieftains in the south and get them? Or had they already been purposed as 9 for men and 7 for dwarves from the get-go? And then I have one little follow-up, which is, do you think if Celebrimbor hadn't perceived Sauron's plan, he would have made a 4th ring of earth as well?
Oh, that's
interesting.
an interesting question. I like that one. Well, Sean, I'm going to let you dive in first while I try to dig a little bit into Unfinished Tales. You maybe speculate a little bit, see what we've got.
Okay. Well, I'm actually going to start in the Silmarillion. I'm going to go straight to Otrapada first because
that's what I was thinking too.
This does answer one of your questions, Phil, about whether Celebrimbor made 7 for dwarves, 9 for men, or whether Sauron just sort of gathered all these rings to himself. And I use that word gathered because I'm looking at it here in the text, because it actually does say that Sauron gathered into his hands all the remaining rings of power, and he dealt them out to the other peoples of Middle-earth, hoping thus to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. Yeah. 7 rings he gave, this is Sauron, he gave to the dwarves, but to men he gave 9, for men proved in this matter, as in others, the readiest to his will.
Right.
So the way I interpret that is that those 16 at least were not meant for dwarves or for men specifically. I think those were just the 16, let's call them the B+ A- rings that were of a kind. Maybe some were more powerful than others, and we'll get to that in a moment. But these 16 rings were all more like each other than the others. Sauron gathered all of those, and Sauron was the one who decided to give 7 to dwarves and 9 to men. Now, the reason he gave more to men is because men were more easy for him to sway.
Men are weak. I was there, Gandalf.
Yeah, I mean,
I know this.
As in everything, men are just more subject to temptation. We also know from elsewhere in Otrapada, actually just later in this paragraph, that the dwarves indeed proved tough and hard to tame.
Yeah.
They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows.
Yeah.
I don't know if Sauron knew this already, and that's why he gave 9 to men and 7 to dwarves, or if he just knew men would be an easier target, and so he gave more to men for that reason.
Right. He would have been better off giving like none to the dwarves and 16 to men.
Yeah.
Then he would have had 16 ring wraiths.
Boy, wouldn't that have worked out?
Boy, yeah. That scene at the ford would have been a little different, wouldn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
So I
Parking lot at Fort of Rivendell is a little full today.
Good old Bruin and Ford.
Yeah, they must be offering free car washes. Anyway.
So I think that's the answer to that. I think that the 16 rings were all of a kind, and it was Sauron who made the decision to do 7 and 9.
I think so. And they were of a kind because they were made with Sauron's aid. Whereas the 3, as we get from Unfinished Tales, were made by Celebrimbor alone.
Just by the elves, and
with
the
a different
was
power
made
and
just
purpose.
by Sauron, yeah.
Exactly.
Now,
so
I do think it's interesting that he gives 7 to the dwarves, because that's such a symbolic number for dwarves. And maybe 7 has a symbolism for the dwarves, just as 3 has a symbolism for the elves, when you're thinking about the elvish kindreds.
Right. But why 9 for
Is
men?
there somewhere in the Middle-earth legendarium that 9 has a similar symbolism for men?
Symbolism, and yeah.
Not that we're aware of, really.
No, not that I've been able to detect.
But I think if there is any symbolism there in the 7 and the 3, it is just symbolism. There's nothing to suggest that he gave, that he specifically gave 1 to each clan of the dwarves, right? Or maybe he did, but not for the not for the 3.
Yeah, I think so, because we got in Otrapada, we find that it is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring.
Oh, that's true. But do we
now
know
that
those
assumes
are all...
that each of the dwarf kings has 1 horde and none have 2?
That's a good point. So we're assuming that those are the 7 different clans, but
right. We don't have explicit mention of that, but that's a pretty strong implication there.
Yeah, you're right.
From the dwarven perspective alone, each of the 7 hordes is founded on a ring of power.
Of the clans. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you look at the 3, of course, there's nothing that lines the 3 up with the 3 kindreds of elves, but that's a different matter entirely. So,
that brings that last question into play. Would Celebrimbor have made a 4th ring of earth, since there was now one of fire, of water, and of air?
Before we get to that one, Alan, let me back you up a little bit, because Phil asked something else that was interesting about the idea that Celebrimbor didn't want to give up the 7. Did you find that in Unfinished Tales?
Yeah, it is mentioned here. Here we get the fight at the House of the Myrdain. Sauron took the 9 rings and other lesser works of the Myrdain, but the 7 and the 3 he could not find. Then Celebrimbor was put to torment, and Sauron learned from him where the 7 were bestowed.
Yep.
This Celebrimbor revealed because neither the 7 nor the 9 did he value as he valued the 3. The 7 and the 9 were made with Sauron's aid, whereas the 3 were made by Celebrimbor alone with different power and purpose.
Okay.
And then there's a bracketed note from Christopher who indicates that it is not actually said here that Sauron at this time took possession of the 7 rings, though the implication seems clear that he did so. And then he goes on to talk about that thing we have mentioned before, the belief among Durin's kin that his ring was given to him by the Elven Smiths themselves and not Sauron.
Right.
But nothing is in the text giving us that. So
right. Okay, so Celebrimbor did not want to give up the locations of the 7. There's nothing in Unfinished Tales to suggest why that is the case.
Well, I don't think he wanted to give any of them up, but it sounds like perhaps the 9 rings were there.
Maybe right? Sauron just
there. Sauron took the 9 rings,
could be,
and other lesser works, but he couldn't find the 7 or the 3. And when he was tortured, Celebrimbor said, "Sure, you can have these other 7 lesser rings, because I don't value those or the 9 you have taken as much as I value these 3."
Yeah.
And of course, Sauron had co-made, so to speak. He was a joint partner in the manufacture of those 16 rings.
Yeah.
Whereas the 3, of course, were not involved with him at all.
Right. That's interesting.
So,
but they definitely are more like each other than not, the 7 and the 9.
Yeah. And the thing is, we don't know if that distinction is being made kind of ex post facto, so to speak. As we're reading this text,
right?
Was it that Sauron took 9 of the 16 rings, but 7 more rings plus the 3 he couldn't find? Or had they already been identified as the 9, the 7, and the 3?
Did he already?
We don't really know.
Right. I know exactly what you're saying. It's not
now we
don't know for sure that those 9 rings that he got a hold of were considered a complete set at the time.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just don't know that.
Right. So yeah, that's good. I'm glad you found that.
Yeah.
So now let's speculate a little bit. If
sure
Celebrimbor had more time, would he have made a 4th ring?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he was able to make all 3 and have time to discuss what they were going to do with them, right? This is when he discovered the existence of the One Ring, and went to Lorinand is what the text says, but he went to Lothlorien to take counsel once more with Galadriel. And the text tells us, the narrator in Unfinished Tales says they should have destroyed all the rings of power at this time, but they didn't have the strength.
Mm-hmm.
So Galadriel tells him to go hide them and to disperse them. He leaves Nenya with her and sends the others to Gil-galad, who then gives one to Círdan. So there's time for all of this dispersal. There's time for him to travel to Lothlorien. So I don't know. It seems to me like he was done. Maybe he was only making one for what he perceived to be each of the powerful kingdoms of the elves. Maybe one for himself, one for Rivendell, one for Lothlorien.
I don't know. I mean, that almost implies that he had already decided who to give them to.
That's true,
before
which
that,
he had not done.
Yeah, because I think we just read that for Tolkien Reading Day, didn't we? And
we did.
Those decisions were made after.
They were. They were made after they discovered the existence of the One Ring.
Mm-hmm. But
and
yeah,
when Celebrimbor realized he'd been tricked.
But why not make an Earth Ring? That is a really interesting question. Especially when you line up the elements to Valar, you get that Aule is associated with Earth, and we know how much the Noldor, especially Celebrimbor, loved Aule.
I know. Celebrimbor and Aule, they're like this, man.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That is an interesting question. I think you're right. There's nothing to suggest that he was interrupted in the middle of this project, that he would have made a fourth ring. Maybe, again, thinking of the symbolism inherent in making 3 rings, maybe he thought, I don't know, maybe elves just love the number 3 for lots of reasons. And so he thought, 3 rings, that's the perfect number of rings.
Maybe.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't see anything to suggest that he would have made a 4th ring, though, just to round out the elemental set.
Right. I don't necessarily see that. We do have a couple of potential comments here. Demay, go ahead. What do you have for us on this?
Well, if he had made that 4th ring the Earth Ring, who do you think would have gotten it?
Oh.
Ooh.
Well, now we have to speculate on a speculation. Well, Gil-galad gave one to Círdan and kept one for himself. Well, assuming that Celebrimbor hadn't been, turned into a pincushion, I think Celebrimbor himself would have kept that one, had that been an option.
Mm-hmm.
But, when he gets together with Galadriel and she says, you got to get the rings as far away from Eregion as possible because, Sauron's going to find them. He's all right, well, let's disperse them.
I like to think that if Celebrimbor had meant to make a 4th ring that was a ring of Earth, that he would have wanted to keep it for himself.
Right, because of his affiliation with
that
Aule.
works.
That makes sense.
Works so well for the symbolism.
Maybe he was going to make the One Ring. Ooh. He would have made the One Ring to rule them all, the one of Aule. No, I'm kidding.
Well, and that raises an interesting question: whether there's some sense in which the One Ring can be considered the 4th ring, the ring of Aule, since Sauron was Aule's servant at one time. Yeah, I don't think it is. I think it's much more than that. But
I agree.
But it's a fun speculation.
Isn't it? Jim, you've got a comment here as well. What do you have for us?
Well, 2 short ones. One of them is that we know that Sauron put some of his native power into the One Ring in order to let it rule the other ones. But would he have possibly put just a teeny bit of his power into the other rings, the 7 and the 9? And if so, would that maybe put a practical limit on how many rings he could make? And then the other side comment was the One Ring we know about from the dwarves. Thror said to his son Thrain, well, it needs gold to breed gold.
Right. Mm-hmm. Which is a great comment.
That seems like a very dwarven purpose to accumulate wealth.
It is. It is exactly that. And that is what the dwarves used their rings for. In Otrapada, that's what we see. They used their rings, the dwarves, only for the getting of wealth. But wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet Sauron. So, but that's a good question about the idea of him infusing some of those 16 rings with some of his power. I don't know so much of it that it was a measurable amount of his power as much as it was just his influence, that he knew how they were made. He knew how he could then control them with something else. I don't think he had to put any of his power into it in order to do that. He just had to be part of the process so that when it came time to make a master ring, he knew all the, so to speak, the back doors into these other rings.
It's like the idea of malware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I thought was a great analogy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Speaking of which, Phil, go ahead and let's wrap this up. What do you have for us?
The only thing I wanted to add was, I mean, I tend to think of the rings as kind of engines of will.
Mm-hmm.
And so under that kind of metric, if, for the dwarves, they would naturally increase treasure. They would naturally be used to increase treasure.
Yeah.
For the men, they would be used to increase power. For the
right.
elves, they would be used to prolong kind of the fairy
Prolong their
world, as it
longevity,
were.
yeah.
Right. So in that way, all the rings are kind of similar, but they get applied differently according to race and your level of power, I guess.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
It's like the idea that the ring confers power according to
its kind,
to the kind of its bearer. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The ring sort of
and even to the personality of its bearer,
mm-hmm.
right? Gollum versus Bilbo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we see that. All right.
I see a few people in the chat here saying that the One Ring really seems like more of a ring of fire to them, and I also see some amazing Johnny Cash references in the chat. So kudos to you guys for those. But
the Ring of Fire.
But yeah, no, I want to just go on the record as saying I don't think that the One Ring is a ring of earth. I just, as we're kind of talking through the elemental,
the idea of an elemental, right?
Yeah, there's an interesting symmetry to the idea that Sauron was a servant of Aule, and that seems to be the element that's missing. But no, I think the One Ring is really much more than that. I don't think it's a particular element. I think it's the ring of domination more than anything.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It is the security key
that
can run all the others. All right. That was a great question, Phil. Thanks for throwing one out there that really gave us a chance to dig and to speculate. Now, Sean, who do we have up next?
Next up, we've got Bruce.
Bruce. Welcome, Bruce.
Good evening.
Or I should say welcome back.
Hello, Bruce.
Thank you. I'm Bruce from Southern California. And I'd like to follow up on what Jim had just said, something about putting native power into the 1 and 9 and 7.
Okay.
Spirit points. You knew it was coming.
Yeah.
Dumire, and to a lesser extent the Ainur, have finite spirit point capacity, SPC, to conduct their augmentations through expenditure of SPC, and corruptions of the realm of Arda or the children therein.
So the question then is, do they have some sort of almost a like a gamified, do they have a mana bar that, a spirit point capacity, as he says, that as they do things that they expend it and it's finite? It's a very interesting question. So, and the question is, do the Maiar and then, in specific, but then also the Ainur in general, which would include the Valar. Let's talk about that, Sean. What do you think?
Yes,
speculation.
It's a really good question. Fun speculation. Obviously, Tolkien would never quantify it like that.
Well, no, that's
because
true.
he doesn't. He
not
frustratingly to us sometimes as fantasy
He's
fans.
not that kind of wizard. Yeah.
Right? Yeah, exactly. As fantasy fans, we all want to see the world quantified in that way, myself included. And Tolkien doesn't really give us that kind of details on the mechanics of the world. But I do think that to some degree there is a finiteness to the power that all the Ainur have. And I think we see this in a couple of different ways. For example, we see the creation of the two trees is something that the Valar could only do once. Once
correct.
It's been done, they can't ever do it again. Now, it's not like they just create the two trees and they're spent. It's not that they can never do anything again. Mana's depleted and they're completely...
They just can't do that again.
They just can't do that again. So there is a finiteness to their power.
It's like a spell from a scroll as opposed to a spell from the book.
That's an interesting way of thinking of it, so that it's not a matter of the power expended, but just this idea that we see in the Silmarillion that there are some works that can only be created once.
Right.
So that could be that, as opposed to, it could be a sense of just the uniqueness of the spell, for lack of a better word, as opposed to the quantity of the power expended.
Could be.
We definitely do see certain Ainur expend their power and not get it back. And I'm thinking of the ones that are bound to the flesh that they have in Arda. We get, obviously, Melkor Morgoth gradually expends his power to the point where he can't even heal his own limp. Thank you, Fingolfin.
Exactly. Yeah.
We see the same thing with Sauron.
Went halt of foot, lame of foot ever after. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So we definitely know that Melkor put so much of his own power into Arda that he lost the ability to do those demiurgical things that he did as one of the Ainur.
Great word,
And-
Sean.
And thank you very much.
Sorry,
It's one of my favorites.
Demiurgical. That's a good one.
It's Tolkien's. I can't take credit.
Of course
for
it is. No, I know.
But yeah, so we see Melkor do that, and Melkor basically becomes so limited. He puts so much of his power into Arda that he's basically just a big bully.
Yeah.
By the time
One
he
wonders
falls.
though if that happens as a result of the turn to evil. Like, does that cut them off? Does it become finite because now they can't get any renewal from Iluvatar?
Well,
I don't know. I mean,
I think
we do see some things with Melian, right? That's probably where you're going next with that, right?
That's where I was going to go next with that, because I was going to say Sauron is another Melkor. We see that with Sauron. He can, after the fall of Numenor, he loses the ability to appear fair anymore. And so then he's just ugly and terrifying. And then after he's destroyed at the Last Alliance, then he loses that form again. He doesn't become
he loses
a big
physical
flaming
form
eye,
altogether, right? He becomes just this.
But then he ends up getting
spirit.
some sort of physical form later on, because Gollum, we talk about the 9-fingered hand and everything.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's hard to quantify in and of itself. But
That is.
Melian, though, is an example of one of the good Ainur who eventually does lose her ability to to change her raiment and to do some of those Ainuran things that she normally would be able to do. And I think it's actually in Osanwe Kenta. That's the essay in Vinyar Tengwar about telepathy that surprisingly has some notes in it that talk about how, and I don't have that in front of me. That's one of the physical books I didn't bring upstairs.
And unfortunately, I don't even have a copy of that one.
I'll have to order one of those for you.
Oh, well, thank you, sir.
But yeah, that essay surprisingly has a lot of interesting stuff about what happens to Ainur who spend too much time in their bodily form in Arda. And there are a couple of things that can bind them to that raiment.
Yeah.
And make them, they're not quite incarnate the way the wizards are.
The Astari, right.
Right. But they are bound to, can you remind me of the phrase? Because
the chains and trammels, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
I love that phrase.
Yeah. That phrase is used of Melian specifically, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, specifically talking about her having reproduced, having born a child.
That's right.
What, essentially made her connection to humankind, not humankind, I should say, but incarnate kind.
But the children of Iluvatar, yeah.
Right. Taking the form of a child of Iluvatar as opposed to an Ainu.
Right.
That's what made that permanent, really.
And we talk about, Tolkien talks about how there are certain actions that Ainur can do in their raiment that will eventually bind them to that body. It is things like eating and drinking. It is reproducing, to put it gently. It is...
not to put too fine a point on it, right?
Exactly.
Say I'm the only bee in your bonnet.
Yeah, there you go. The My Giants reference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so he talks about how the Valar didn't really feast much, even at festivals, because they knew that if they ate too much, that they could get bound to their bodies. And Melian did this more than most.
There's my problem. I eat too much, and therefore I'm bound to
your body.
Yeah. My body gets bound to earth.
This raiment, I just can't control this raiment anymore.
I wish I could change my raiment.
And I think Tolkien even says that Melian was susceptible to it because reproducing is one of the most binding things you can do.
Absolutely.
So, but I do think going on from that, we talked about this when we talked about Balrogs, which folks listening as we're recording this haven't heard yet, but by the time this comes out on the feed, people will have heard us talk about Balrogs.
2 weeks ago, right.
It is strongly suggested that there is a degree to which doing evil things can bind you as well. And we talked about the possibility that maybe Balrogs are somewhat bound to their raiment. So yeah, I think we've kind of gone a long way around, but I do think that this is something that is partly associated with doing evil things, but not just evil things, doing worldly things.
Exactly.
Combine them.
It may go faster with evil things.
Yeah, I think it probably will.
May get to that point of no return, so to speak, earlier in the process. But yeah, I until they get to that point, it would seem to me that it is a renewable resource, so to speak.
I think it is renewable to a degree, yeah. I mean, again,
Manwe's not running out of juice anytime soon.
No, that's true. I mean, with the caveat that there are some things they can only do once.
Well, right.
But
a one-time spell or one-time, function. But yeah.
Now, an interesting question associated with that is, do they need to rest after doing a whole lot of stuff?
We know that Valar have to rest after certain things. Tulka slept.
After certain things that might bind them to the
Bow,
chains
chicka,
and
wow,
trammels of art.
wow. Yeah. That's right. Tilkus was
Yep.
all into the chains and trammels there, man.
Yeah.
Oh, no comment. No comment. I'm just going to leave that right there.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So yeah, they must need to rest sometimes. And I have to
Orom's
believe
just
that-
rolling his eyes and shaking his head, going, I thought I taught you better, sis. But anyway.
But yeah, I do think that they must have to rest sometimes. If
Yeah.
Tulkas can be weary, then I think Valar can be weary.
Nice
And
throat clearing, sir. Yeah.
They may need to rest sometimes. So
I think
yeah,
so.
it
You
makes
got to remember,
sense.
they are created beings.
Exactly. They're
They are
finite.
not self-dependent. They may be eternal going forward. They may not have an end going forward, but they had a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
They're not self-existent as Iluvatar is, so therefore, yeah, they're going to be limited to some extent. But and that's what makes me think that the points would be renewed by Iluvatar in the case of the Valar who remain
Could be.
unbound,
Could
shall we
be.
say.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly are not eternal. Like you said, they're
No.
eternal going forward. We know that they're not omniscient, and
Right,
they're
we
not
know that for
omnipotent
sure.
either. So
No, they're not.
So that does imply that there are automatically limitations on their power. So yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good question, Bruce.
I have no
Good
idea how to quantify it.
Right, that's the thing. That's the thing. It's like how do we
How many? What was it? SPC? How many spirit points?
SPC? What's the SPC? So that would just be like the cap. But then, how quickly does that refill?
Yeah.
Does it refill? Does it change based on whether you're a Vala or a Maya? Does
Are
it
there
change
certain
whether you're
enchanter
incarnate?
buffs that'll make you replenish it faster? For my EverQuest friends out there.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Are there places like in Lotro? Is there hope and despair? And if you don't have a hope token, then your SPC goes down. I don't know.
But there's definitely something finite about their power. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Bruce. It looks like you've got a little bit of a follow up there. What's up?
Just a brief one. You guys had come across it. SPC could be regenerated by the regeneration capacity of SPC for a given character. However, done is done. Melkor could no longer expend SPC for next to anything he wanted when the War of Wrath overtook him.
Yep.
Right. Yeah, there's going to come a point where that capacity is gone. I know I theorize that maybe the ability to renew that energy, to renew those spirit points, if we're going to quantify it that way, is that ability to renew is eventually lost. It's either lost through the commission of evil acts, or it's lost through being bound to the chains and trammels of Arda, as Melian was.
And to be fair, we don't know that Melian completely loses her ability forever.
Because she kept the girdle for a long time.
Yeah,
she did, and she only
and we know
removed
she
it
goes into the
voluntarily
west
when she left.
after Thingol is gone. She goes into the west. So
after Thingol gets stabbed in the thighs and bleeds out from little dwarf wounds,
we're bringing up all the classic,
all the pierced elves,
elf murder moments. Yeah, the pierced elves,
the pierced elves.
That was the name of my punk band in high school.
I know, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
But anyway, you were saying.
Sorry.
I derailed you.
Yeah, you did, but it was well done. Goodness, I am completely lost. Yeah, no, I think that it's the ability to renew that does eventually go away, and we see that happening again with evil characters or with those who get bound, one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's where I'd land on that. Again, it is speculation. It's all fun. It's all interesting to think about. Certainly, like you mentioned at the beginning of the answer, Tolkien just simply didn't quantify it that way, and there's no way for us to shoehorn that solution in. But certainly like thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Well, Sean, who do we have up next?
Next up, we've got Joe.
Joe, welcome, sir.
Howdy.
Howdy,
Joe.
You must be from Texas.
Actually, I'm from Louisiana, but I live in Texas.
Wow, just like
you know
Sean.
What? Those are the best kinds of Texans, I always say, is the ones born in Louisiana.
I'm with you, Sean.
Yep.
How do you pronounce that? Louisiana accents?
Louisiana accents.
I don't know. I'm just Louisiana and Texas. I'm just trying.
Yeah,
to
no.
something.
I see what you're doing. It's good.
Yeah.
I never thought about it before.
All right.
But everyone around me who's actually born in Texas will tell me you're never a Texan if you weren't born in Texas. Joe's probably heard the same thing.
Never, no matter how long you're there. All right.
I've had kids who are Texans, so I think I'm a Texan now.
That helps. You got anchor babies in Texas.
Exactly. Got Texan anchor babies.
All right, Joe, what do you have for us
man.
tonight, sir?
I've been going back and forth between a few different questions, and so I hope I picked a good one. At the risk of making all of the Tolkien fans in the world roll their eyes a little bit, I have a question on allegory.
Okay.
But it's a nuanced question, so you're gonna have to bear with me a little bit.
Fair enough, we will.
So traditionally, Catholics and medievalists have a sense of allegory that doesn't necessarily mean a one-to-one correspondence.
Okay.
So I'm just going to give a brief rundown really quick so I can ask my question.
Sure, that's fine.
We can talk about a literal sense of scripture, and what we mean by that is what the author intended when he wrote what he wrote.
Okay.
But we could also talk about 3 spiritual senses of scripture, and these aren't necessarily directly intended by the author of scripture, but they are senses in which maybe the divine author might have intended something. So we have the allegorical sense, which is something that points forward to Christ. We have the moral sense, which is how the scripture comes alive in our own lives. And then we have the anagogical sense, which is how the scripture points forward to the end of time. And one scripture can have all 4 of these meanings. And so just for an obvious example, if you take King David, according to the literal sense, was the king of Jerusalem.
Right.
Or the king of Israel, right?
But he's also a type of Christ, a predecessor.
Right.
Christ,
but he also points forward to Christ, right?
Yeah.
So and this is like highlighted throughout the scripture, right?
Yeah.
So there's somehow a dual sense of scripture going on there.
Of course, right.
Okay. So we also know that it wasn't only scripture that people interpreted in this way. For instance, Dante, in his letter to his patron Congrande della Scala, says that that his patron should interpret the Divine Comedy using these 4 senses as well. So there might be the literal, Dante is in hell and he's doing this, but there's also the, I should interpret this in light of this later event, or I should interpret this in light of this event, and et cetera, et cetera. And so my question is, would this kind of allegory, quote unquote, be a more of an applicability, to use Tolkien's vocabulary, or do you think it would be a kind of allegory that Tolkien would not want people to apply to his work, given that Tolkien was himself a medievalist and would certainly have been familiar with, for instance, Dante?
The Dante example is a really good one for that exact purpose.
Tolkien was definitely familiar with Dante.
That's a great question, Joe, by the way. I have to say that is wonderfully nuanced, and we're going to have a fun time with that, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to jump in just from the literary perspective. I don't know that much about medieval theology or medieval interpretation of scripture, but I can certainly say from just the literary standpoint, yes, Tolkien knew his Dante, so that's an excellent comparison. There's a few references to Dante in the letters, in Tolkien's letters, I should say, and Tolkien knew other medieval allegories as well. Pearl is the one that's coming to mind right now. Pearl was a Middle English allegorical poem, very theologically minded poem that Tolkien liked enough to have translated. You can get it in a collection with his translations of Sir Gawain and Sir Orfeo.
Yeah.
And I heard a really fantastic paper at TextMoot recently by Richard Rowland, friend of the show, who's helped us out with some Germanic philology stuff before. I hope he won't mind me mentioning him here.
I'm sure he won't.
He gave a fantastic paper about Pearl and Tolkien that got me started thinking about all kinds of cool stuff like Smith of Wootton Major, which it has been argued is allegorical. We had a really cool conversation about Leaf by Niggle after that paper,
which is
absolutely allegorical. And there were also things like, the allegory of the tower in the Beowulf essay. So Tolkien was no stranger to allegory, either as a medievalist or as a writer. We know for a fact that he wrote 2 very clear allegories in the Allegory of the Tower and Leaf by Niggle, and potentially also Smith of Wootton Major.
Right.
I would go back to his introduction to Lord of the Rings for his famous words about allegory.
Cordially disliking it.
I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations. Now let's hold that. And have always have done so. Sorry, I like my words better, Professor. And always have done so, he says, since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purposed domination of the author.
Love that line.
Joe, in your question, you talked about the fact that these different allegorical readings of scripture or a work of literature are, I think you actually said that there's one.
They're not one-to-one.
They're not one-to-one, so it's not what we traditionally consider allegory. But you also talked about the fact that they can be subjective. They can be based on the reader's own interpretation of the work, if I heard your question correctly. And
At least in one or two senses, yeah.
Yeah. And so if that's the case, then I think Tolkien would align that more with applicability than what he calls allegory, in the sense of allegory that he doesn't like. So I think that Tolkien would be perfectly fine with us reading that kind of applicability into his work, because it resides in the freedom of the reader, which is what he says right here is what he's in support of.
Yeah, I think when he talks about allegory, and that's the thing, I want to make sure we're talking about the same terms here. When you talk about allegory in that context, the idea that there are these, maybe secondary or tertiary readings available, whether we're talking about scripture, whether we're talking about Dante or other medieval works, that's one sort of allegory. I think the allegory that Tolkien is referring to here in the prologue or in the foreword is that one-to-one allegory, that very specific, this means that and no other thing. That's the kind of thing where it's the domination of the author as opposed to the freedom of the reader. If the reader is free to take the text and apply it in a way that is similar to allegory, and they see resemblances or representations, that's their freedom to do so. But it's not the reader's freedom to insist that that is the only way to read it.
Yeah.
Because then you're saying that the author wrote it as an allegory, period, end of story. Right. And that's what Tolkien was very clearly refuting. So I think as long as we make that distinction between those the two uses of the word allegory, then I think we're good.
I think you're right. And it's certainly not symbolism that Tolkien has an issue with.
No, not at all.
And it's not, it's not even, no, it's not symbolism that Tolkien has an issue with. It is the idea that the author is purposely saying this is the one reading, or that a reader is saying this is the one reading that the
Here's
author
a riddle.
intends.
You figure it out, and there's only one correct answer.
Right.
That's what he was avoiding for sure.
Yeah.
But the idea that there might be an alternate reading, symbolism, representation, some sort of thing along those lines, not a problem.
Yeah. Now, and I think it's interesting that we're saying this, because we actually have received some email from listeners who challenged us a little bit on the idea that we go back to Tolkien's intentions in writing the text so often. Yeah. And, because there's a couple of different schools of thought in terms of interpretation, like authorial intent. Right, exactly. Authorial intent versus reader response criticism of a literary work. And I think Alan and I would both agree we are pretty firmly on the authorial intent side of things.
Yes, we're
are. Constantly going back to Tolkien's letters, Tolkien's biography, to the degree that that's useful. When you look at things like the Great War and stuff like that. We are all about authorial intent here at the Prancing Pony Podcast, but I don't think that we've ever said that's the only way to read it. It's just the way that we approach the text. And
that's correct. And I think it's the way that if you're going to approach the text, that's the way to start. And then if you want to apply some other meaning, you want to find something that's more personally applicable, by all means, you have the freedom to do so.
Well, and to be fair, I think anybody can sit down with a copy of The Lord of the Rings and talk about what it means to them and talk about what they read in this. And we do that sometimes too. But when we give things the Prancing Pony Podcast treatment, it means going to the letters, going to the history of Middle Earth and stuff like that. And those are all authorial intent sources. So again, I bring that up because it does kind of bear on this idea of Tolkien's, that the domination of the author is not the only way to read something. I just want to point out that we are well aware of that. It's just, it happens to be the way that we kind of start approaching the text. And I think readers can read the text and kind of come up with their own reader response approaches to it on their own.
Yeah, I agree.
So Alan, the other thing I was thinking about here in regards to Joe's question about reading these allegories forward in a way where, you know, some of these stories, like you talked about, some of the Old Testament stories of like King David can sort of foreshadow the New Testament story of the coming of Christ or something like that. That puts me in mind of On Fairy Stories and the part where Tolkien is talking about eucatastrophe.
Yeah.
And he talks about how all fairy stories have a eucatastrophe, and each of those eucatastrophes is a type of evangelium. They're all sort of
Evangelion.
They're all sort of pointing to, or I kind of see them as little stand-ins for the big eucatastrophe of human history, right?
Yeah, when we get into On Fairy Stories, he talks about how in the eucatastrophe, that is the eucatastrophe in fairy stories, we see in a brief vision that the answer may be greater. It may be a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. And then he acknowledges that, hey, I'm diving into kind of dangerous territory here. It's presumptuous of me, he says, to touch upon such a theme. But then, yeah, he talks about exactly that. He says that, how does he put this here? I'm looking for it. The story has entered history in the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation with a capital C. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. The story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. Then he has a great line here. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised then to see that he wrote much of what he wrote in a way that sort of shines the light in that direction. Again, not allegorical in a one-to-one representation. We're not telling you, you know, Aragorn is a Christ figure.
This is the one
Gandalf
way
is
to
a
read
Christ
it,
figure.
right?
Right. No, that's not, you're going to see elements of that, of course. You're going to see bits and pieces of things consistent with Tolkien's worldview in his writings if you come from that perspective. And if you don't, you're not going to see it, or you're going to see it and dismiss it. And that's totally fine. That's your freedom as the reader.
And I think especially because he was a medievalist, he was aware of the way medieval texts frequently did this. And I'm sure he was conscious of it in his own writing.
Of course he was.
And I suspect that bringing it up in On Fairy Stories in that way was partly a nod to that idea, suggesting that, you know, fairy stories can be read in that way, just like allegorical literature of the Middle Ages.
That's a very good point. Joe, I see your hand raised. What do you have to follow up with?
Just two quick comments.
Sure.
The first is going back to what y'all were saying about how y'all mainly focus on authorial intention.
Right.
I think that's perfectly consistent with the medieval approach to texts, because in the actual theology classroom, they would have stuck with what does the author intend to say here. They wouldn't have dug into the spiritual senses of Scripture. They would have stuck with the literal sense of Scripture.
Okay.
In this, so I think that that's perfectly consistent with the medieval view that Tolkien would have known. So I think that that's. I don't have a problem with that. I love.
I would just add on that I know that Tolkien himself took this approach to Beowulf. If you look at the Monsters and the Critics, that really is largely about the Beowulf poet's intentions in writing that work. So I think you're spot on, Joe, but I'm sorry, please go on.
And then my other comment was, I really like this reference to On Fairy Stories. It got me thinking, in some way, we're supposed to read this as having actually happened in our world. Right. Like this is supposed to be the history of our world, the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and all that. And so in some sense, this is, in Tolkien's worldview, divine providence is a thing. And we see this with Iluvatar, right? Iluvatar's, it's the Spabimi thing,
yes,
right?
It is.
And so God speaks through events. He doesn't just speak through some sort of written word. And so somehow these events, quote unquote, that took place, quote unquote, in our past are might in Tolkien's worldview be supposed to point towards that sort of ultimate consummation of history.
Quite possible.
anyway, those are my two thoughts on y'all's answer. So
excellent. Well, thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. And that was another great question. I'm loving the questions tonight. I mean, I usually do, let's be honest, but
we've had
these are
some
particularly
really
good set tonight.
We've had some really good, deep, nuanced questions tonight, and we've had some,
ones that have required us to really think and not just pull up an answer someplace.
Yeah, it's been great.
Well, by process of elimination, Sean, I think next up is James. Am I right?
That is correct.
All right, James, welcome. How are you tonight?
Hi, everybody. James in Virginia.
Welcome.
It's 11:30 at night. I am on 4 hours of sleep and a big cup of coffee, so let's do this.
Let's do this. Let's get it done.
But at the time of this recording, we recently did the attack on the pass of Carathras.
Right.
And, of course, y'all had some discussions and then a follow-up episode talking about, was there a spirit of will? And I think y'all circled around the idea that it might be the will of Morgoth.
Mm-hmm.
Because since he was the one that raised
the Misty Mountains, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would dispute that a little bit, because in the previous episode, when they were just coming through Holland, they have a moment where it seems like everything has a voice, has a spirit, because Legolas seems like he can talk to the stones, where he mentions, oh, well, only the stones remember them still.
Right.
So, going deeper into that would suggest that everything has a spirit. Old Celtic mythology and Native American mythology,
Sure.
I think even going so far as like Hindu mythology,
Okay.
had the belief that everything has a spirit, whether it's sentient or sapient or what, we don't know, but there's something there.
Okay.
So to go even deeper than that, there are a couple of other spirits that we've already met earlier in Fellowship. Our old friend Tom and Goldberry, who I think we circled around that one as well, that they are earth spirits and a water spirit, or earth spirit and a water spirit, respectively, just incarnate.
Well, I think we landed on, Sean, didn't we land on Tom being sort of a byproduct of the music itself?
Kind of, yeah, sort of a, I think
I don't want to give him an elemental.
What I remember about Tom was the idea that he was sort of a byproduct of the music, or just sort of a spontaneous combustion of the secret fire in Arda.
Yeah, a combination of the two. He came into existence when Iluvatar spoke Ea and Arda came into being, and he was byproduct's the wrong word, but he sort of spontaneously created.
What was Tom Shippey's phrase? There was an Anglo-Saxon phrase that was once applied
sort of
to
a one
Adam.
of a kind.
There's the sui generis thing that he's a one of a kind, but there's also this phrase that the Anglo-Saxons used to describe Adam as sort of I think it's self-sheftaguma, like a self-made man, not the way we say that phrase today, but like a sort of a spontaneous creation,
right?
In the way that Adam was. I guess Adam wasn't really biblically a spontaneous creation, but like without a father, I guess.
Right. I mean, Adam wasn't born as a baby and developed into a man. He was created as a man.
Okay.
And out of clay, and God breathed into
him.
So
maybe that's what Shippey's getting at with that. Yeah. But I don't know that Tom is really an elemental spirit so much.
No,
Goldberry though certainly is. And
Goldberry, I would land on Goldberry being a water spirit for sure, and not of the same degree of any kind as Tom. But I don't know if that changes your question, James. And I'm sorry to have gone off track, but I wanted to make sure that we were talking about the same thing here before you went on. But please feel free, because I like the direction you're headed with the question.
Right. So if we can more or less establish that, like Tom and maybe even Goldberry existed before the Valar actually came into the world, quite possibly, because they talk about how, before the Dark Ones, came from outside.
Right.
It could very well be possible that, all things, even the stones, the mountains in this case, all had a spirit of sorts in them, and just over time it becomes stronger or awakens a little bit, or goes back to sleep a little bit. Because even in Two Towers, Treebeard talks about how the trees had voices even before the elves really woke them up, so that the elves could talk to them more thoroughly, I guess might be the word there. But so that was just a thought that I had on that. I just wanted to know how y'all might think of that.
Okay. That's an interesting thought, because I mean we talked about it we talked about the idea that Caradhras's evil will was a fragment of Melkor that Melkor left in him when Melkor raised the mountains. If Melkor can do that, then can the other Valar do something similar, either intentionally, the way Melkor does, or is there some sort of, I'm going to use the word byproduct again, is there some sort of byproduct of Ainur's subcreation that leaves a bit of the subcreator's own self in the natural world? I don't know that Tolkien is going quite in the sort of like that animistic direction of everything having its own spirit, but is there a sense in which maybe the music being sung into existence by one of the Valar leaves a mark on something in Arda, and that something is sort of appears like a soul or like a voice in that thing? And so there's, because Ulmo or maybe one of the Maiar sang a particular river into being, that river now has a water spirit that can give birth to Goldberry, or that, because Aule sang something about some particular rocks, or one of his Maiar sang about some rocks, these rocks now have some sort of imprint of that Ainu in them. Maybe we don't really know. I certainly think that Caradhras is exhibiting more of a will than a lot of these things, and that could be because Melkor really did this with malicious intent. But
he raised those mountains himself, so yeah,
right,
with the purpose of hindering Orome.
Right, yeah, he had a specific purpose in mind, and that could have given the mountains some ill will towards any of the good guys who tried to cross them.
Almost
does that
agency,
point to yeah, and does that point to an idea that maybe other things created by other Valar can have similar agency for good or for bad? Yeah, I guess maybe it kind of does suggest that. I don't know if I don't know if they're all true spirits, and I don't think they're all in the same order of Tom Bombadil, because I think Tom is something different.
Tom
I think
is something radically different.
The very language that we use to refer to Tom marks him as something different. We
master
talk about how he's,
and all of those things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that he's the master of more than just one particular element. I think he's the master.
And he's the eldest, and he's the master of everything within his domain.
Yeah. I really do believe he's a sui generis. He's his own thing.
Yeah, he really is.
But something like Caradhras and Melkor's will, the fragment of Melkor's will in Caradhras, could maybe explain things like the river woman that gave birth to Goldberry.
Could.
Sure, why not?
Interesting.
I don't know. I mean, there's really nothing to say one way or the other, but
I do want to be careful, though, with the idea of putting spirits in everything, of going with that sort of
like the animistic view, like I was saying.
Yeah, animistic.
I don't think that that's what Tolkien's thinking of here.
No, and I would almost go back to our last question to answer that and say that, again, Tolkien was specifically, you might be able to read that in there, and that's your privilege to do that. But if we're looking at authorial intent, I think we can say that because Tolkien was trying to create something that was consistent with his existing worldview, we wouldn't see a spirit in every inanimate object, because that isn't going to fly with the way he would view things.
And I agree with that, and I'm not going to argue that point at all. But I will say that there are some inanimate objects or things that it would be inanimate in our world that have spirits. I mean, you look at the Ents.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, of course, and they were specifically animated directly by Yavanna through the music.
That's true.
And then even if we indeed give agency to Caradhras, then we're saying that that's something that Melkor, in his might, in his power, in his subcreative power, even if it was perverted and twisted, was able to at least imbue it with some sort of agency, even if not individual spirit.
And I
the
think
Ents
that's
are individual
an
spirits.
Distinction.
And that's the thing. Ents
that's
are
an
individual
distinction.
spirits with Treebeard differing from Quickbeam, differing from, I can't remember all the other names off the top of my head. Each one of them unique, each one of them different, each one of them individual, because that's how they were created, through the music, through Yavanna, with obviously with the permission, so to speak, or with the granting of Iluvatar, or they wouldn't exist that way. Caradhras is not an individual, an individual entity, perhaps. It's more of a hostile agency.
I would agree with that. I would call it a fragment of Melkor's will. I mean,
Right.
It's not its own thing. It doesn't have its own spirit. It's just a piece of Melkor. And I'm thinking of
lots of pieces of Melkor all around the world, after all.
Yeah. Well, Tolkien talks about that Melkor
Morgoth's
ingredient
ring,
that's in
right.
all of Arda, really, to some degree. But I'm also thinking of some of the stuff about orcs in, is it Morgoth's ring or is it War of the Jewels? It must be Morgoth's ring.
I think it's
Tolkien
Morgoth's
is
ring.
talking about. I think it is. When Tolkien is talking about some of his later ideas about where orcs came from, because he started struggling with the idea that they were corrupted elves.
Yeah.
One of the things that he did talk about at one point was maybe orcs are not. I don't think he landed on this, but he did kind of come up with the idea that maybe orcs weren't alive. Maybe they were just animated bodies with a fragment of Melkor's will in them.
Yeah.
Again, I want to make it very clear. I don't think that's where he landed, and that's certainly not the view we would take.
They certainly demonstrate agency.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're looking at the legendarium as a whole, that's not where we land on it. But it was something that went through Tolkien's mind at one point for orcs.
He considered it,
I tend to think of Carothers in those same terms.
As a sliver of Melkor's cruelty and will and malice.
Yeah, exactly. As opposed to its own kind of spirit. So
an individual spirit with free will, choices, all of that. Yeah.
Now, what does that mean for the river woman? I have no idea.
I know. That's the thing, is it doesn't solve that, does it?
No, it doesn't. Not one bit. But I do tend to think that when characters, especially like elves, talk about different things in nature having a voice, I think maybe what they're hearing is they're hearing echoes of the Valar's voices or the Ainur's voices,
or even the voices of the elves themselves. I mean, you're almost hearing when Legolas talks about the stones lamenting the elves, you're almost wondering how much of that is the elves themselves.
Oh, that's interesting.
How much of that is the echo of the elves?
Oh, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
I don't know. We'll see. But in the meantime, we have a couple of comments here. Phil, what do you have for us on this?
The only 2 cents I wanted to add is regarding kind of how consciousness exists in inanimate objects or animate objects. If you look at Gandalf and Tom, they both describe themselves kind of similarly at times. I mean, Tom says, "Don't you know my name yet?" And Gandalf says, "I am Gandalf," and Gandalf means me. Right. Now, I don't know Christian mysticism as well as I should maybe, but I know in all the mystic traditions, consciousness kind of permeates everything. And so for instance, in Sanskrit, consciousness takes the form of nama rupa, which is name and form, anytime it's concretized. And so you hear Gandalf saying that. And so it's kind of like at that early level, right at the first note, those beings that came into play, when they are active in Middle Earth, they're assuming bodies, but they're much bigger than that in a certain level, even though Gandalf may not remember it because he has a few restraints placed on him as an Ishtar. But still, they are, it's kind of a squirrely thing to talk about, I guess. But still, they're basically larger beings embodying themselves in a form. And so Tom's like, well, I'm Tom. And Gandalf's like, I'm Gandalf. And that means me. So with stones and stuff, I'm not sure. And Tolkien, I know, obviously you can't apply anything other than Catholicism to his methodology, I would guess. But still, it seems like consciousness could exist. And certainly a being like Melkor could infuse, the stuff with him, with his power, I suppose.
With his power, a fragment of his own, perhaps a fragment of his own consciousness. Yeah. Interesting. Well, James, it was your question, and you've got something for us here. Let's hear from you one more time.
Yeah, I suppose using the word spirit was a little misleading because I was trying to think of a good way to describe it.
Sure. Just
to get a more thinking on it. I mean, because like I said, the stones and the grass and everything, they had voices.
Right.
Not necessarily, and memories, according to if you take what Legolas had to say literally. But I really do like the idea of maybe the earth or the stone or whatever had its consciousness, and when it was raised by Melkor, turned to Morgoth, and to be a hindrance, and then he left his will in it. Maybe it may have perverted that spirit a little bit, gave it more agency through the power that he left in it. So whereas it might have just been a la-di-da, I'm here before, and now it's all of a sudden I am the master of my small little domain instead. So
could be.
Yeah. I think there may be, and this is something we probably want to dive into more at some point, but there may be some support for the idea that there's an echo of the music of subcreation in a lot of things in Arda, and
Sure.
maybe Melkor, because he is he who arises in might, maybe with the power that he had and the intentions that he had, the malicious intentions he had, maybe he was able to leave a little bit more than just a bare echo.
Yeah, I think you may be right. That's certainly wouldn't be
Really,
beyond his ability.
really cool question, though.
It is. Man, some fun questions tonight.
Yeah.
I know we're running a little short on time, but we have 2 more questions that were actually submitted by folks who were going to join us, but who were unable to at the last minute. Sean, you got a quick one from Chad that we want to talk about briefly?
All right. So, yeah, we've got the first of our mail-in questions here tonight comes from Chad, our good friend Chad in Texas. And he wrote to us with a one-word question, the shortest question in the history of the Prancing Pony podcast. And his question is simply, Galvorn.
Galvorn. Galvorn?
That's it. That's his question. Galvorn.
Galvorn.
And maybe it's a Jeopardy thing, like we're supposed to answer in the form of a question. Like, what's a really great name for like a Norwegian black metal band?
Galvorn.
There probably is one already.
I'm sure there is.
Yeah.
All
So
right,
I'm
so
not
the question then.
I'm not sure what the question is, but the question is Galvorn. So I just thought I would spend a little time talking about Galvorn. Just some ideas that I have about it.
All we have really is an etymology, right?
We have an etymology. It comes from Shining Black. In the chapter of Maiglin that talks about Eol and his Galvorn, it says he named it
Maiglin,
Galvorn.
The ultimate bad boy.
I know. It says he named it Galvorn for it was black and shining like jet. And basically that word Galvorn really just means black and shining. It comes from the roots Gal, which means shine.
As like in Gil-galad.
Gil-galad and Galadriel.
Or Galadriel.
A lot of our favorite words.
A lot of other shiny things, yeah.
Yep. That second part, Vorn, V-O-R-N, actually is a lenited form of mourn.
Lenited! So Lenition! We bring Lenition back.
We bring Lenition
All right.
back.
Lenition, where have you been, my old friend?
I know, it's been a few episodes since we talked about Lenition. If you think of the Moor that's in Mordor, which means black land, or you think of Mormagil, the black sword.
Or Morgoth, black foe.
Or Morgoth, the black foe. That Mor, M-O-R, actually lenites to a V because of where it is in this word. And again, I don't know enough about Sindarin to know why it lenites after this L, but for whatever reason, when you put that Mor after the Gal, the M lenites to a V. And so Galvorn just means shining.
Because Galmorn doesn't sound great, I guess.
I guess that's it.
Yeah,
Galvorn, it could just be a euphonious.
Phonetic aesthetics,
thing. Yeah.
Euphoniousness.
So yeah, Galvorn means shining black. It is, of course, sort of I guess we could say it's a meteoric metal of some kind.
Yeah.
We don't know
it's clearly
a whole lot
not
about
a natural element in Arda itself.
No.
In Arda. It is in Ea, obviously, because a meteor would have come from still in the created universe, not from outside of it.
Yeah.
But it's not native to the planet, no.
So, yeah, the only other thing we really know about Galvorn is this. I guess it is the same stuff, isn't it? It doesn't really say that here, does it? Okay. All right.
Yeah. It's the same black metal source.
I'm just, for some reason, I thought it said that explicitly in the text, and I don't see that.
I think it might, and we're just missing it.
Okay. Because we're tired and it's late.
We are tired. It is late. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beleg chose Anglekel as a sword of great worth, so named because it was made of iron that fell from heaven as a blazing star, would cleave all earth-delved iron.
Yeah. Well, so that's good, because the other thing that I know about this metal is that there's a couple of places in other mythology where meteoric metal is a really cool thing to make a sword out of. And right now I'm thinking,
is that a genre of music? There's heavy metal, there's speed metal, and there's meteoric metal?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's really like soaring, really airy. Really, no, that's terrible. I'm sorry.
Wow, that is bad. Actually, awful, I keep coming back to that. I don't know that we are certain that Galvorn is that.
I know.
It is the metal devised by Eol, but we don't have anything saying that it came from the same source as those swords. The swords were meteoric in nature.
Right.
But there's nothing that says, in fact, I'm going to say that it isn't. Here's the text that makes me think that. It's right before the fact that he named it Galvorn. He says, There he learned much of metalwork, talking about the dwarven mansions of Novigrad and Belegost, and came to great skill therein. And he devised a metal as hard as the steel of the dwarves, but so malleable that he could make it thin and supple, and yet it remained resistant to all blades and darts. He named it Galvorn, for it was black and shining like jet.
That's interesting.
So he devised it, as opposed to found it in a meteor. So I know that's going to drastically change your answer.
No, I mean...
So in this case, it's an invention, but it doesn't seem like it's
know.
meteoric in nature.
I think it might have been. We just don't know for sure.
That's true. That's true.
I mean,
we
because
don't
the
know
swords
exactly.
were black.
Yeah, they were.
Right?
And we don't know when he developed the metal Galvorn in the timeline in relation to when he discovered the meteoric source of iron for the swords.
And developed the metal could mean, like, refined it, right, from the meteoric ore.
That's true. Could be. So there's no way of saying that it isn't.
Yeah.
We just don't know that it is.
Right. Well, if it is the same stuff, then this part of my answer applies. And if not, then it doesn't. But regardless of whether it's Galvorn or not,
we won't worry about that part.
The meteoric ore that those swords are made from is also a really cool idea that Tolkien got from, probably among many other authors, Lord Dunsany.
Oh, yeah.
Because I was just starting to read The King of Elfland's Daughter by Dunsany not too long ago. And very early in that book, the hero gets a sword made of thunderbolt iron, which is like a similar kind of iron from the sky. So I think Tolkien might have been playing with that idea.
And when you get hit with it, you're thunderstruck.
Oh.
Sorry, man. I had to bring a little AC/DC. We haven't used AC/DC much lately.
No, we haven't. And while we're talking about metal, it's the perfect place to do it. So.
Yeah, exactly.
So. Anyway, I don't know if we've answered Chad's question at all about Galvorn, but we've certainly given the etymology. And
that's about all
we've talked about what might have been made from it or might not. We really don't know. So
we don't know.
There you go, Chad.
There you go. Have at it.
And
hope you enjoyed the non-answer answer.
Here's your Galvorn. Take it. And if you have a follow-up, let us know.
That's
you
brilliant.
know where to find us.
Yeah, you do. Well, and then we've got one last question from Rose, who is going to join us. Shire Rose, for those of you in our Discord channel. She says, so I haven't finished reading through the Silmarillion, nor have I listened to all of your episodes covering it. So maybe you've answered this question. If you have, my apologies. It says in the Silmarillion that wisest of the Maiar was Olorin. He too dwelt in Lorien, but his ways took him often to the house of Nienna, and of her he learned pity and patience. If this is so, why was Saruman chosen as the head of the White Council and considered to be more powerful than Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings? This seems particularly foolish to those of us who know the ending. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and thanks. Well,
that is a good question.
That is a good question, and we will eventually answer it in our episodes in season 1 when we get to Otrapata, which is, by the way, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. That actually explains exactly the answer to that. I'm going to go ahead and pull this passage up. So here we go. This is a little bit past the middle of Otrapata. And here's what we get. We get the first appearance of the Astari, whom the men call the wizards. Now I'm going to read from the text. None knew at that time whence they were, save Círdan of the Havens, and only to Elrond and to Galadriel did he reveal that they came over the sea. But afterwards it was said among the elves that they were messengers sent by the lords of the west to contest the power of Sauron if he should rise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of good will to valiant deeds. And he goes on and talks a little bit about who they are, what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually we get to this. At length the shadow returned, and its power increased. And in that time was first made the Council of the Wise that is called the White Council. And therein were Elrond and Galadriel and Círdan and other lords of the Eldar. And with them were Mithrandir and Curunir. And Curunir, that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief. And here's the reason. For he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. However, he wasn't the first choice. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir should be the head of the council, and Saruman begrudged them that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance, save to those who sent him. So, really, Gandalf was given first shot at being the leader of the White Council, and he said, no thanks. I'm only going to have allegiance and ties to those who sent me, so I don't want to be the leader of this council. So they said, all right, fine. Who should we pick? Well, Saruman's studied the devices of Sauron of old. Let's let him be the chief.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, Rose, he wasn't their first choice, Saruman.
Mm-hmm.
Gandalf actually was. which is something that Saruman was rather unhappy about.
Yes. Absolutely.
So that answers that one. Was he considered to be more powerful than Gandalf in Lord of the Rings? That's a very interesting question. I don't know that he...
I'm trying to think if there was anything in there on...
He was certainly considered to be more crafty, more cunning.
Yeah.
Certainly more knowledgeable in the ways of Sauron.
Yes. And in Otrapada, we do see that he was the eldest and came first.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And he was subtle in speech and skilled in all the devices of smithcraft. I think he was the oldest. He was pretty clever, and he talked a good game.
Oh, yeah. We all know what his voice was. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not prepared to say that nothing somewhere says he was.
So I can't say that he is or isn't considered to be more powerful. I mean, at the end of the day, certainly Gandalf 2.0 is more powerful.
Certainly.
But the whole thing is Gandalf, the original Gandalf the Grey, would not have been interested in power, and Saruman was. So he's going to go after what he wants, and that is going to in turn make him more powerful.
Yep.
Cleverer, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I guess the whole point is that you can be cleverer, you can be smarter, and you're still going to lose if you're, working in the wrong direction. When you're working against the will of Iluvatar, that's bad things are going to happen.
And one thing we do know is that regardless of whether Saruman seemed to be the greatest, we know that when Gandalf came, he seemed to be the least, right?
Right.
Don't we see? He was the last one that came, and he seemed the least of all of them.
That's correct.
But as it turned out, he ended up being the most powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he did. And I think, my goodness, I think that does actually wrap it up tonight. Thank you, everybody, including those of you who couldn't be here tonight, for the great questions and discussion. We really appreciate you joining us for Questions After Nightfall. And we're sorry we couldn't get to a second round, but these were some deep questions. So we got to answer them for a long time.
Thank you all so much.
Good questions tonight. And we hope you can join us again for the next one. To everybody listening, we hope you can join us again next week when we get back to the book with the first part of Book 2, Chapter 6, Lothlorien.
That means it's not very long before I get to start doing my Cate Blanchett impression, right?
Oh, well, I think we're all not looking forward to that, Sean.
Oh,
sorry. I'm going to have to.
You're going to love it.
That.
You're going to love it.
We're going to try that off air first. Anyway, listeners, we want you to remember that the talk continues not in Cate Blanchett's voice all night long at the Prancing Pony.
That's right. We've always got lots of discussion happening in our social media spaces. At our common room on Facebook, you'll find comments, questions, corrections, and more on every episode, probably especially on this episode, as well as updates from us throughout the week. Just look for the Prancing Pony Podcast on Facebook and click the like and follow buttons.
And now we have another common room over on Reddit. Great place to hang out. Some amazing discussions at r/PrancingPonyPod. And as always, you can find us on Twitter and on Instagram with the handle @PrancingPonyPod. So follow us wherever you happen to be. And if you like us, please consider sharing us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, wherever you can find Tolkien fans.
And if you really want to let the world know your feelings about us, give us a review on Apple Podcasts. The more reviews we have, the more visible the podcast is. That helps others find us and this great community of Tolkien fans we've built together.
And finally, if you'd like access to exclusive content like postscripts, quarterly specials, PPP swag, and more, check out patreon.com/prancingponypod to find out how you can join the fellowship of the podcast. Now, as always, we want to thank everybody who's listening, but we do want to give a very special thank you to our patrons at the Kierdance contribution tier, several of whom are here tonight. DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Emily in Texas, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Paul in Colorado, Jerry in Texas, Bruce in California, Mario in Utah, Seth in Texas, Ella in California, and Joseph in Texas. Thank you all so very, very much.
Make sure you don't miss a single episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe to the show through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your questions, comments, and most of all, well, your best questions and corrections to the answers we've given today to Barlaman at theprancingponypodcast.com.
Barlaman is increasingly less punctual with the mail since we keep talking about him behind his back. But we'll get back to you as soon as we can, and your comment or question may be featured on an upcoming show.
As usual, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners, but until next time.
Farewell, friends.